Oh, so which one of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he found it, he lays it on his shoulder and rejoices. And then he comes home and he gets together with his friends and neighbors and they have a party. Everybody has a party. I would like you to use your imaginations just for a few minutes. Pretend you're a flock of sheep. Just pretend. Just think about it. You're a flock of sheep. I'm one that's sort of wandered away and not with the rest of the flock. What am I thinking? What's going on in the mind of a sheep who gets lost? Well, in your imagination, you can think about it. I wander around and I say, those other sheep left me. I fell asleep and they walked off and went someplace else, and I don't know where to go. I just feel so alone. I feel like I just have nobody. Oh, listen, there's a wolf over there. That's pretty scary. That wolf might come and get me. Oh, I wish somebody would come and find me. I feel so lost. And then the sheep herder finds the sheep. And now we can come back to reality. You no longer are a herd of sheep or a flock of sheep. And I'm no longer that lost sheep. I use that little story or that little fun thing because I think every one of us have times in our lives where we believe that we are lost. That something happens that says, I am just strayed away from the community of God, and God doesn't love me because God isn't here to get me, and I just feel all alone, and it's a scary world to feel alone in, and I don't like that feeling. Now, that's true for me, and I suspect that's true for every one of us. There are times where we feel that lost being, where we feel God really isn't present. How can God get me out of this mess? How can God bring me back to the flock, the community? And then all of a sudden something happens, and you realize that God was there all along. I like to use the example because it's a pretty major one in my life because it moved me from the southeast to the west. I was the associate in a church in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and when the rector of a church resigns and goes on to something else, at that time in our history as a church, the whole staff had to quit. And they asked me to stay on for 6 months while I looked for a job and they looked for a rector, and I would do half-time my job and half-time the rector's job. Now, any of you who are familiar with the church know you don't do that. The rector is a full and a half-time job to begin with, and then the associate has probably an equal job in a large church. So by the end of the 6 months, they came to me and they said, we're not ready for a rector. And I said, I'm not staying. I'm leaving. Now, during that 6 months, I had looked and looked and looked for a job, for someplace to go. And all of it had been centered on the southeast, because that's where my family was. My mother and dad, aunts and uncles, all of them. So I didn't even think about the West. And one of the ways I was looking for a job was to go to conferences that would help me to learn and grow, but also help me to look for a job. And so I went to one out off of the coast of Seattle, somewhere on an island. Beautiful spot. And I met a lot of people, and a lot of them were from the West. And one of them happened to be from Pocatello, Idaho. And lo and behold, she said, "We're looking for a rector, and you sound like you might be the one that we could use." And I said, "Well, I'm interested." And so she showed me the parish plan, whatever. I can't remember the name of the official name of it. But anyway, she showed me what the parish was about. And I said, "Well, that looks interesting." And she looked at my resume and she said, "Well, that looks interesting." So went back to Spartanburg, and about 6 weeks went by, and I thought, well, that one's out the window. There's no more. And I was beginning to get a little discouraged because the 6 months was almost up, and I didn't have a job. And 2 days before the 6 months was up, I got a call from somebody in Pocatello, Idaho. "We're interested in doing a phone interview with you." Okay, so we had a phone interview. Then another 2 weeks went by and I was without a job. And I'm wondering, what's going to happen? Where is God in all this? After all, look at all the time I spent getting ready to be a priest. Doggone it. God, you ought to have something to say to me. And I felt like I was out there on a limb alone. And then I got a call from somebody in Pocatello, Idaho. "We want you to come out for 3 days over a weekend, and you'll preach and celebrate the Eucharist at the services on Sunday." And I said, "Okay." And then I got thinking, why would I go out west when I don't want to go out west? I don't want to move out of the southeast where my family is. God, you're playing games again. Come on, let's not do that. So I came to Pocatello for 3 days. And the people who took me to the airport to fly home, as they dropped me off at the airport, they said, "Well, we'll see you soon." And I said, "Yeah, you probably will." Because I fell in love with Pocatello. And I fell in love with Idaho, even though I never knew where Idaho was until then. And so I moved from east to west. Now I use that story because there was a time in that search for a job at that time that I felt very alone. I felt like nobody loved me, especially God was not loving me. Now, in retrospect and looking back, there was a powerful lot of God's love that I didn't recognize, because God was saying, "You have to do my will." Remember that. My will, your will be done, not mine. So God's will was being done. And then that winter, I may have told this story before, I asked them how the weather was, and they said, the weather. And I said, "How was winters?" "Oh, winters we get a little bit of snow, but then we get these southern winds and it blows off." Okay, how about the temperature? "Well, the temperature goes down to below 0 for a couple of days and then back up and so on." In the middle of winter, I had to preach a sermon about lying. And said, "You lie about the weather." By Christmas, I couldn't shovel any more snow out of my driveway because the piles were too high. And then in the first part of January, They were closing the schools because there was 2 weeks of below zero weather that never went above zero. And then I realized one morning, God, you brought me out here to test me and put me in the desert that you have been trying to get me to go to, and I've refused. I've been too independent. And so here I am, Lord. I'm in the desert. Now what? And life began to explode into new life. I use all of that because I think that we are the lost sheep periodically, and we need to have the shepherd that comes and brings us back into the flock. Now, lest you think that I'm the shepherd, forget it. I'm not. I once preached a sermon about a bishop not being a shepherd. And the bishop was there and he was not happy. But I did it because I was schooled by, in Pocatello, a person who owned sheep. And he said, you have a shepherd who leads at the beginning, is out in front, showing the sheep where to go. And then you have behind them a sheep herder that keeps them moving. And the sheep herder has dogs that keep out and around and keep the sheep together. So the bishop is the shepherd, or actually the sheep herder. God is the shepherd. God is the shepherd. The bishop is the sheep herder. And guess what the priests are? Woof, woof. We're out here trying to keep you guys going. And the older I get, the harder it is to run around. But, and you know, I think it's fun when we can have a sermon that has some laughter and smiles in it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we know that God is with us, but there are times when we feel alone. Those are the times when we have to trust that God is walking with us, not ignoring us. God is always present in our lives. Sometimes it's harder to see God at work than it is not to see God at work. And so my gift to you, or my sermon, ends like this. And when he comes home, he calls his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice for me, I found my sheep that was lost." Let's rejoice with God, because God finds his sheep all the time. And that's a wonderful feeling. I don't mind being a sheep at all. Amen.
Amen.